Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and sorry for the slight technical glitch at the start. We had the keynotes overrun, and then I had a problem getting into Zoom, so it was not my day from that point of view. Briefly introducing myself, I'm Pieter de Wilde. I'm a professor at the University of Strathclyde. In the past, I've been the chair of IBIPSA England, so I was involved with Sukumar in setting up this BSO event. At the moment, I'm also the vice president of IBIPSA World, so I'm still deeply involved in IBIPSA. I'm going to keep my intro short and leave the time to the speakers because we already lost a little bit of time. So I'm going to go straight to the first speaker, Sergio Poco Aquilar, and give him the floor for a 15 minutes presentation, after which we have some Q&A. Sergio, floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so I'll start with my presentation. I'm going to present to you this paper that is part of my PhD research. So first, I want to introduce to you incremental housing. So this is a strategy that's taken by most households in the global south, as they don't have access to traditional financial products like mortgages. So they rely the construction and improvement of their houses on small loans and, of course, on savings. So even though this appears on nature, there is also schemes in which governments and organizations promote and help people to develop their houses in this way. Nevertheless, most of these schemes are based on are more worried about the socioeconomic parts of housing provision more than on the environmental part. So we wanted to make a tool to promote environmentally wise incremental microinvestment in extension in the residential sector in the global south. And this tool is to support both dwellers and the institutions that help them. So this is the workflow of the tool. So it's based on 4 models, 3 of which are developed as part of the PhD, which is the social model, the geometry generation model, and the implementation of a Q-learning algorithm. And then we have an energy model, which is used as a black box and comes externally prepacked and is just used to get the performance of the geometries. So in this case, we have, I will start talking about the Q-learning algorithm, how it's implemented and how it works. So as any multi-agent reinforcement learning algorithm, we have transition between states, which are controlled by actions. There is a learning process, which is a host of episodes. And because each state corresponds a reward, by repeating this learning process, we can find an optimal set of states and actions. So as time passes, an optimal policy stabilizes. And the agent evaluates next action complexity to maximize the reward. So with this, we have a geometry which has this performance, and we are trying to, we have an objective which will be to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, we can optimize and have the better performing geometry, both at individual level and at neighborhood level. The second model is the geometry generation model. So this was written on Python, which is an object-oriented programming language. And of course, as any of these, we have one class here, and it has attributes and methods. So the attributes, for example, are the state, which it's communicated to the Q-learning algorithm. And this is a string formed by T's and F's. And what happens is that the buildable space within the lot and also the maximum height, it's formed by cubes, which are modules. And each of these cubes has a point in the middle. So each time the building occupies this module, we can determine if this point is within or outside the building, the building envelope. And we can form a state with this string formed by T's and F's. We also have the size, which is just counting the number of points that are inside or outside the geometry. And by just having the geometrical properties, we can calculate the area of the wall and the roof surfaces of the extension, and therefore we can have a cost of that extension. Also, as a method, we have the extent, which is the extent function, which is the main method. And this accepts an integer as an input. And with that, it can, this integer is one of the possible phases where the house extends. But it can also be one integer determining that this geometry won't grow on that time step, or that it will go back to its original state. And of course, we have also the attribute outrep, which, well, it outputs the geometry, the resulting geometry, and it sent it to the energy model. So then we have the interaction between the models. First, we had a social model, and this I haven't talked about because it wasn't ready when the paper was submitted. But this social model, it works as a trigger. So it has an extension probability based on census data, on whether that it's likely that that household will extend this geometry on that given time step. And this sends a signal to the Q-learning algorithm, which orders the geometry generation to mutate the geometry. And at the same time, this geometry generation sends the geometry to the energy model, which gives out a performance. But at the same time, the geometry generation model gives out other information needed for the Q-learning algorithm, like possible states, possible actions, current state. And as well, the social model gives an available budget for a given time step at the space needed by the household on a given time step. So the Q-learning algorithm optimizes the form of the building for that given year until it finds a stable policy, finds a solution, and it saves that for the next time the social model triggers the other models. It does so until we reach the last year, and then we have an optimal solution for the neighborhood on that last year. To integrate the workflow with high performance computing, this was written using Python on Rhino 3D. And the advantage of this is that we can use Rhino, eventually we can use Rhino Compute to send these whole solutions to the cloud, to a high performance computer. So to test the interaction between the models that were ready at that point, we made 2 experiments, one with single agent reinforcement learning and another with multi-agent reinforcement learning. These are some of the configurations. So we have the model size, the location. This was in the southern hemisphere, so the location is in Peru. And because of this, and this is in winter, we have the north at this site, which is hidden by the other buildings. And the objective of the agent will be to try to access the maximize solar accessibility without depleting the financial resources. So we also have the costs and the space needed and budget. So space needed and budget will usually come from the social model, but in this case, they were predetermined. And then also we have the Q-learning algorithm, which has some inputs, right? Like the alpha, which is the learning rate, the gamma, which is the discount factor, and the epsilon, which is the exploration rate. So we want to have a high epsilon at the beginning so we can explore or find random linear solutions, but this will decay. So in the end, the solutions will come from the learning algorithm rather than from random solutions. And alpha is as well configured according to that. So we can remember, we can forget easier the ones that are random solutions and remember more the ones that are based on the algorithm itself. So we also had another experiment with 2 agents, but in this case, the 2 agents just maximize the performance of one, which is the one that is colored. And the second agent didn't need to inform about its own space need or budget, but it does when it falls on a non-manifold state. So there is a state in which we need to restart the geometry because of some considerations within it. So the settings were the same as experiment 1, except that the space was reduced, the space needed to 4 modules. The budget was as well reduced because of that. And this was because this was the first experiment of multi-agent learning. And we wanted to keep the computation demand down. And because of this also epsilon was fixed. So here we can see the results. And we can notice that, for example, here on the later episodes on single agent reinforcement learning, we stabilize on the high end of accumulation reward per episode. And here we can see some instability because epsilon is still high. So here is epsilon, which is high at the beginning, and then it decays. And this instability is precisely because we are still exploring and have some random solution, while at the end we have stable solutions that are based on the learning algorithm. But we can see also the performance and episode performances versus episodes, how this exploration allows us to find higher performing solutions in the early stages, and then we can stick to one. And even though we continue exploring, we don't find a higher performing solution. We stick to it, and eventually in the end we stabilize there. In multi-agent reinforcement learning, as I told you, we were using the fixed epsilon, so the pattern is constant all over the time. But we can see that we mainly stick to the highest reward, and we can also see that the performance is higher performance is fine at the beginning, but this doesn't vary much because of the size and also because of the low exploration number. So here are the conclusions. The socioeconomic model still needs to be developed, but we have shown that the interaction between the other models is working as it should. But of course, we have to implement the social model, put a larger number of agents to simulate the whole neighborhood. And we also need a building performance that has a more sophisticated model, so probably also an energy model which is more complex. Just to show you what has been produced after the submission of the paper, where we are already able to use that on many agents. For computational capacity here, we're only showing 3. And thank you very much for listening. And yes, I'm open to questions now.
Thank you, Sergio. And it was a very nicely timed presentation, so that gained some of the time we lost back. Any questions from the audience? Anything in the Q&A? I see we have 15 participants. There's no open questions. Okay, then I will ask a question myself. You say you need a more advanced model to do the energy performance in the later thing. What are you using right now, and what are you thinking of starting to use?
Well, right now, well, for these experiments, I was using Grasshopper, and within Grasshopper there is a plugin which is called Ladybug. So this is just basically for solar exposure. So on the later stages, I plan to move to Honeybee, which also uses Energy Plus. So that will need more inputs than the ones that I have right now.
Okay. And another question, well, of course, if you stay in that environment with Rhino and Ladybug and Grasshopper, a lot of work has been done. But in your general system, are you thinking about any ways of validating this and verifying? I mean, I look at it and I see a very nice combination of models that interact and that look great with nice plots. But the question is always, can you trust it? And how would you poke your finger in there to see whether it does what you expect it to do?
Sure. Well, each model is validated differently, right? Because they are different. So the validation of the social model, for example, has to do with the data on which it's based, and it's validated also because I have panel data of a survey that's done among households in Peru. So I can validate that against the different years that they have been following the same households. Now, regarding the energy model, of course, this comes pre-validated, so there is not much things to do there. And regarding the growth, well, this is based on the general variables that are included within the definition, the general definition that we have on incremental housing, which is just people accumulate money, they need the house, and then they build additional rooms. So in that sense, there is not a proper scientific validation, but it's based on the general concept, and it should be validated because it's based on the variables that are widely accepted as being the triggers of incremental housing. Okay, good.
I have a final look in the Q&A. Nothing in there, no open hand. So unless somebody raises their hand now and wants to ask an urgent question, then let's thank Sergio and move on to the second presentation, and that almost brings us back on schedule. Next presentation is from Nicolas Schweetberg. If you take over and start your screen, and we can take it from there.
All right. So hopefully you can see that it's presenting correctly. All right, super. So I'm going to talk about the optimization of passive design implementations at an urban scale in an AM climate with a case study simulation case study in Chattagram in Bangladesh. So just quick overview. So brief conversation about the background, though I think a lot of the other keynotes and presentations have hit some of the key points for why this study was conducted. Talk briefly about the aim, the methods, and then some of the findings, and particularly the limitations or challenges of working within this context, and then the next steps. So, brief background. Chattogram is the second largest city in Bangladesh, which is one of the 10 most populous countries in the world. Over the past 2.5 decades, it's had a fairly steady population growth. And also, interestingly or importantly, the city is Bangladesh's largest port. So this raises some questions about thinking about economic activity and people's livelihoods, health and well-being, et cetera, tied to activities that are conducted outdoors, particularly in areas with high levels of heat and humidity, and what challenges that might pose for, long-standing economic activity, and how health and well-being may also be tied to the ability to earn income, et cetera. So, the first keynote from yesterday talked about some of the challenges in an Indian context of working in hot, humid climates, and that's fundamentally why this study was selected, or this city was selected as a case study to look at the challenges of a hot, humid climate. So the AM Köppen-Geiger climate zone is a tropical monsoon. This also corresponds with the ASHRAE 1A climate zones. And also just a brief refresher on the urban heat island. So, of course, the urban heat island is, a result of the inputs of our urban environments, the materials that absorb and re-emit solar energy, but also anthropomorphic activities, our buildings, our traffic, et cetera, that produce heat. And so these contribute to these higher temperatures in urban areas compared to the countryside. And it can also have a time lag effect where this heat persists into the nighttime as well. So again, sort of going back to the context, why Chattogram, why this city and this type of city, and this question as well. So urban heat and heat in general, excessive heat can cause health risks, right? And it affects different at-risk groups differently. So depending on age, et cetera, there can be other underlying factors, but some of the health risks resulting from heat and urban heat range from anything from reduced sleep quality, dehydration, heat stress, and fatigue, all the way to death as the most extreme. And of course, going back to the context in the case of Chattogram with a large port, economic activity is tied to working outside. And so if we have, extreme heat or rising heat or urban exacerbated heat, this can affect people's well-being while conducting work, put those at risk, or potentially shut down economic avenues if work cannot be done in instances of extreme heat. So then specifically, the Chattogram selection is a case study. So this climate zone, this AM Köppen-Geiger, the ASHRAE 1A, is found throughout the Global South. So hopefully the commentary here is applicable as well, going to Jacques' point a little bit earlier about Global South to Global South learning. Within the city itself, there's also a broad socioeconomic spectrum, and within that, there are different levels of capacity to adapt. And so some residents are more at risk because they might not be able to purchase or engage with active systems, for example. And the city itself has no fundamental base plan. So we've seen this in a couple other presentations. While there may be planning suggestions, there is, urban development might not follow strict plans, and there is informal development as well. There are also questions about the reliability of certain urban infrastructures, such as electricity access, et cetera, which can, again, limit some of the possible adaptation measures, particularly for certain groups of individuals. So moving to the aim, simply put, the aim was just to test the ability of these neighborhood-scaled passive design measures and their ability to mitigate the formation of the urban heat island. So taking a look at their effectiveness in that regard. So in order to conduct this, the secondary objectives were identifying a metric to do this. And, out of these points on the slide here, I think the most relevant are the last two, is that, some segments of the population may be more exposed, and therefore we wanted to look at passive strategies. And because the city is already highly populated and its population will grow, not only does this sort of place simultaneous pressures on the city in terms of possible need for more housing, which may actually change the urban fabric further and exacerbate urban heat, or may lead to greater anthropomorphic heat generation, it also places more people at risk as the population increases to urban-related heat stressors. And thinking again about the context of this conference, and therefore one of the formations of this paper was, with the exception of Rhino, which was used as the primary geometry tool, the study tried to work as much as possible with open source and freely available tools rather than proprietary or bespoke approaches that cost money. Again, because one of the key highlights within the Chattogram Development Authority's sort of projection for the future was the challenges of cost, and so therefore how workflows and such can be adapted and utilized in context without having a high first cost for potential modelers or users who might work in that context. And just finally, to conclude on sort of or reinforce the why this location in this study, the hot, humid climate is one that is prevalent throughout the global south, and it's also one that is less studied and has this particular challenge of the humidity playing a major factor in the ability of adaptation measures to be effective. So moving to the methodology, I'm not going to talk about all of these in great detail, but I'm going to highlight a couple for the context of this here. But basically, the study conducted of defining the inputs in terms of urban morphology and climate data, identifying the objectives and the parametric definitions, and then conducting the simulations. So for the urban environment definitions, the two most important ones to talk about here were some of the urban geometry, such as the plan and the building heights. This is, this data was pulled from things like OpenStreetMaps and generated via polylines to create an urban geometry. This was the particular area within Chattogram that was analyzed. One of the reasons for the selection was because it was simply one of the areas that had the most data available. So there were areas that had less vegetation data, less building geometry data, and so trying to work with the most one of the more complete data sets was the reason for the selection. So after working through the Grasshopper Dragonfly workflow, there was an urban geometry developed. There were some assumptions and inputs from both the modeler and then some default assumptions within the modeling program. So on the modeling side, or as an input side, some of the assumptions around building typology, construction, height, baseline window to wall ratio, etc., are shown in the table here. And then there were some inputs that were either calculated automatically via the algorithms in Dragonfly, or that were default values, and the default values typically related to urban boundary layers with regards to the formation of the urban heat island. The study also looked at present versus future climate data. So the free and open source EPW morphing tool utilized was the World Weather Generator by the University of Southampton, again, because it's a freely available tool. Within the context of this study, there were two sort of parameter definitions for passive design measures. They were roof albedos and vegetated area, because these were considered low-cost measures and adaptable at an urban or a neighborhood scale within the context of this study. The primary analysis metric or output metric was heat index, which is designed to capture the impact of relative humidity and approximates the real feel of temperature dry bulb within a shaded area. And so these are there are associated heat stress levels within heat index. They range from caution to extreme danger. And so these were the principal output analyses to measure urban heat island formation and the certain risks posed to individual, particularly on the health and well-being side. As I mentioned, the simulations were run in Dragonfly, and for the context of generating the urban heat island adjusted or urban heat morphed weather files, that program uses the Urban Weather Generator, which is developed by MIT. So to conclude with the results and then some of the impacts, this table here just shows on the left that the baseline versus the right optimized neighborhood scale impacts. So we see in the first row annualized dry bulb temperatures, and then the total annual hours of extreme caution danger or extreme danger heat index correlated stressors. So what we see overall is unsurprisingly a risk in more extreme heat index stressors in the future, but there is positive impact from the increase of vegetation and increased albedo of rooftops to reduce total hours in extreme danger in the danger and extreme danger categories. But there's still a fair number of hours where stress exists. And so in the case of the 2080 example there, 3,088 hours of extreme caution is still 35% of the total annual hours. I also looked at heat index performance within a single month, May, which is one of the hotter months in Chattogram. And so we can see the different sort of annual time-based data sets, and so we can visualize the performance ranges depending on the passive measures of the implementation. So, some final discussions. We saw a reduction in dry bulb air temperature and the number of hours of the most elevated heat stresses. And of course, the stressors increase going into the future. So to conclude, some of the limitations, particularly with working with this as a case study and some of the lessons learned there, there was variation in the urban geometry data available, and sometimes sources had disparate sort of representations, and so we had to reconcile that. Vegetation data was limited in parts of the city, and then weather file availability and format didn't always play nicely with some of the open source tools and required a little bit of extra input from the modeler, so it slowed down modeling times. So, looking at these urban heat strategies, it looked at present versus future, these really simple inputs, roof albedo and vegetation levels, and some fairly simple outputs. And with the exception of Rhino, looked at only using open source tools, so that was one of the limits placed on this study. We saw positive impacts in terms of reducing extreme stress, in terms of heat index, and so I think with regards to some of the other commentaries and other presentations that have been had over this conference, on its own, that doesn't mitigate the challenges of urban heat and changing climates, but it may make some other building scale strategies more possible, or passive design at the building scale more attainable when we reduce sort of the neighborhood scale external temperatures and heat stressors. This study did neglect future urban development within Chattogram, so it didn't model future proposals, which could be a potential risk factor. So some next steps include, sensitivity analysis of a detailed versus generalized urban geometry, maybe using a global north proxy first and then returning to a global south location, just to test an area with more open access data, an expansion of what the term passive measures means in the context of this study, maybe looking at anthropomorphic heat generation reductions, such as suggesting pedestrian-only zones, and then, testing future morphologies within urban development. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, and that brings us back on time, which is great. Any questions from the audience? I see there is a question in the Q&A, so let's start reading it out. So Parang Wade asked, what other passive measures could be explored and tested to reduce the ambient temperature significantly by, say, 5 degrees in the context of future climate?
Sure. So sort of what I was alluding to at the end there. So first I'll say the reason that only albedo and vegetation were tested is, again, they were sort of low cost. We've seen projects such as 1 million cool roofs look at, just changing rooftop albedos as a very low cost and effective way to try and mitigate urban heat. Some of the other ones that I would suggest are a little bit more complex to implement, and so there would maybe need to be some other parallel studies talking about whether or not they're actually possible. But, as we know, the drivers of urban heat are also anthropomorphic heat. So as I mentioned, possibly testing pedestrian-only zones or reducing car vehicular travel in certain areas within a neighborhood, or you could even possibly test low emission zones, right, or restrictions that might reduce anthropomorphic heat. Of course, that has a policy implementation that might be challenging in this context. I think one of the challenges, and I don't know, to answer Parag's question there, if within a context where we have higher levels of humidity, if we would be possible to, if just reducing dry bulb heat by 5 degrees would be sufficient, because we'd also still have to account for the humidity impacts. But I think that that's a good question about, what else could be included, but also within this context, what would be sort of realistic to test. Would I suggest then, so I see a follow-up question, would I suggest then white painting of roads and streets? Well, certainly we've seen that, changing the color of rooftops has been very effective. One of the challenges, at least within this modeling approach, and one thing that is worth considering, usually we've seen in other studies that treed canopy at the street level is a little more effective. But this model doesn't really account for the evapotranspiration properties of trees. It mostly counts for the shading properties of trees. And the other thing too with reflection at street level is that it can reflect heat and solar energy from the street onto building envelopes or facades, for example. So that might pose other challenges such as, increased solar radiation or reflected solar radiation on fenestration within, facades facing the street that might increase the risk of overheating within a building, for example. So, maybe a more holistic modeling study would be necessary to test that and see what sort of cost benefits there would be in that regard.
Okay. Just maybe a naive question in that same follow-up in terms of modeling the outdoor environment. You mentioned using Dragonfly, and with the Rhino environment, it's always fun to keep up with all the animals that are around and what they do, and whether it's a ladybug or so. What is Dragonfly doing? Is that like a similar thing to NVMet or?
Yes, and so it is, and it uses, like I mentioned, it for the actual underlying, much like with the Honeybee tools that use Energy Plus, the underlying engine for Dragonfly on the urban heat side is the urban weather generator, which is the MIT tool for accounting for these anthropomorphic properties. But yes, it is. They are comparable products, or they do comparable tasks. The difference is, and one of the reasons Dragonfly was selected for this cost was Dragonfly is $900 American, and NVMet is 2,900 euros.
Right.
So again, trying to look at the first cost. But yes, they do similar things. So to answer that simply.
So it is a bespoke tool for the outdoor environment rather than the indoor areas.
Yes, there is a module that's been worked on that does look at indoor energy use as well and sort of indoor thermal performance.
And combines it.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's quickly have a final look at the Q&A, I think. Okay, there's just a thank you there, so we're good. Okay, then if there's no further questions, then we're completely on schedule. So thank you, Jacob, for bringing us there. And we move our thank you, Nicolas. And let's go for Jacob Björnskov, who is the third presenter. Jacob, if you can start your system and share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So my name is Jacob, and I'm a PhD student at University of Southern Denmark, and I'm going to present this paper called a modular thermal space coupling approach for indoor temperature forecasting using artificial neural networks. So first of all, a bit of motivation for this study. First of all, why is indoor temperature forecasting important? Well, when we have these energy models that are able to forecast indoor temperature, we are able to explore different operational strategies for our buildings. So, and being able to do this, we can, for example, minimize energy consumption, minimize costs, or maximize indoor comfort. Second of all, why it is interesting to use artificial neural networks for this purpose? Well, ANNs are scalable, and they integrate well with the current digitalization we're seeing of buildings, with an increasingly commonly installment of meters and sensors in buildings and data. And third of all, ANNs they have a really large potential for automation. Okay, so when we have these energy models that can predict indoor temperature, in some cases it's really important to consider the thermal coupling between spaces. When the temperature difference between different zones in buildings is very high. But in the literature, when considering ANNs, the most used method has been these very large monolithic MIMO architectures, where you basically have one big model, one big black box model that is able to predict temperatures for all spaces in a building at once. And there are some certain drawbacks of this method that we try to address with this modular approach that we present in this study. Okay, so we considered this case study. It's a Danish university building where we have sampled data from around 70 spaces for a 2-year period. On the space level, we have sampled data for indoor temperature, CO2 concentration, radiator valve position, damper positions, and shades positions. As you can see from the image here, the building has automated shadings. So we sampled this shading positions for each space. And on the building level, we sample outdoor air temperature, shortwave, and longwave irradiation. I should say that the data sampled on space level is sampled on a 10 minutes interval, while the weather data is sampled on a 1 hour interval. Okay, so as we want to investigate how we can develop these modular ANN models that are able to account for this thermal interaction with adjacent spaces, we are comparing two different models. The first one we call the isolated model. It's basically considering all the data sampled for the modeled room, the indoor temperature, CO2 concentration, the different positions on valve, dampers, and shades. And in addition, it includes weather data. And these are then applied as inputs to this model. Then we have another model, which we call the coupled model. We have exactly the same data as input, but in addition, we include the temperature of adjacent spaces as inputs to this model. The two models have exactly the same neural network architecture. So the only thing we are comparing here is the difference in inputs. Okay, so of course, the whole motivation of using neural networks for indoor temperature forecasting is that we are able to automate the development process of these models. And so we need an automated way of identifying adjacent spaces for each space in a building. And so we developed this tool, which we call IFC2Graph, and it's openly available on GitHub. It's a Python tool which takes an IFC file of the building as input, and then it does some geometric analysis of the IFC space entities in this IFC file. And the output is this adjacency graph you can see on the middle image, where the nodes are spaces and edges between two nodes denote that the two nodes or spaces are adjacent. And when we then have information about sensors installed in the building, we can then do this masking, and we get the final structure for the coupled models that we actually present in this study, which is the graph you see at the bottom. Okay, so now we have information about all the adjacent spaces. Now we do some data pre-processing and create two different data sets for each space. One for the isolated model and one for the coupled model. And what I want to show here is that we sample the data set in different sequences. And of course, the more inputs and outputs we include, the less training examples we will have available, because we need, of course, we can't have missing data in our sequence. So when we introduce more inputs and outputs, which might not have data available, we will exclude some data. And this is what is shown by the bottom figure, where we compare the data available for the isolated model and for the coupled model. Okay, so now we have the data sets. We can actually train the two different models for all our 70 spaces. And we can actually look at how the different models perform across different seasons. And these this assessment you see right here is of course performed on the test data set. What we see is that generally the coupled architecture performs slightly better than the isolated one. for the winter, spring, and fall seasons. But interestingly, when we look at the summer season, we see actually a quite big difference in performance, where the median of the 70 spaces is much lower than the median for the isolated spaces. And we can actually explain this by the fact that the case study building is actually unconditioned during summer. It has no cooling systems, which means that the temperatures in all the different spaces is allowed to float almost freely. And this means that we see larger temperature differences between spaces in the building, and therefore the coupled model is more able to account for these temperature differences, because these are supplied as inputs to this model. And finally, I just want to show a simulation example. What does it look like when we then take these models and run it for a period? Here we have 3 different coupled models, one for a classroom, a study zone, and an office. And we have simulated this model for a 24-hour sequence. The green lines are the measured temperature in each space, and the black dashed line is the predicted temperature. So we can see that the model is actually quite accurate in predicting the indoor temperature. The red line is the valve position of the heater in each space. So we can see that the model is actually able to account for this fluctuating valve position, which is caused by the PI controller in each space. Yes, the bottom 3 plots are the adjacent room temperatures that we supply to the models during this period, and on the right we see the weather input also supplied as input. Yes, thank you. That was my presentation, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. We're now running ahead of schedule, which is good. Staying to time. So let's see, nothing on the chat box. Anybody in the audience wanting to ask a question, please put that in. In the meantime, one of my questions with artificial neural networks always is that your model is as good as the training domain, right? So you talked about having 2 years of data. How good do you think that 2 years of data cover all the situations that you might encounter? The typical thing that I would think is especially the extreme weather events like heat waves are the ones that you might be concerned with?
Yes, you're completely right. I mean, neural networks are not very good at generalizing beyond the data you supply in your data sets. So I mean, if you want to explore a scenario, you need to train your model with data, including that scenario, I would say.
But the example you gave, the simulation results, they are very nice and they overlap and they are really, really like you would expect. That's very, very close on. But it would be interesting to see if you could predict for an extreme situation from the data you have, and then hopefully at one point you get an extreme situation and you can see how well you did. It would
Definitely.
be interesting to push the model and see
Yes.
where that works. And also push it to the extreme cold situation, right?
Definitely, I think that's an important evaluation that we will need to do to also validate these models, and as you say, try to push them beyond the default operational data that they have been trained on.
The other thing, which is almost a presumption from all your work, is that taking into account the adjacent rooms, that is what a lot of modelers will do if they do the traditional simulations with tools like Energy Plus. They will assume that adjacent spaces will have adiabatic boundary conditions and will have the same indoor conditions as the room you're studying. So you actually go against that, right? So you say that the adjacent rooms do have a larger impact, and especially in the free-floating situation. So how wrong do you think the assumption of adiabatic boundary conditions is, and what's the order of magnitude you get with that?
Well, I mean, what we see is that typically when you have a conditioned building, it doesn't really matter if you include the adjacent spaces temperatures or not. That is the discovery, or what you would also expect. So I guess this finding is most relevant if you have a building where you have very large temperature differences between rooms. I can't speak to the error that traditional engines might introduce using this assumption, but I would guess in most buildings you have conditioned spaces all year round. Like you have cooling systems and you have heating systems holding some specific set point in each room. So I guess for most buildings this adiabatic assumption holds, but there are other buildings where we don't have conditioned spaces all over the building. So in this case, I think this study could definitely help with more accurate predictions.
And your building, the case study, you point out that the differences are largest in the summer when it's free floating. Is it occupied in that time of year, or is it?
It's mostly unoccupied because it's a university building, so most of the students and the staff is on vacation during that period.
All right.
So the temperature differences is purely due to geometrical differences of the spaces. One space might lie to the west, one might lie to the east, and so on. So they receive different radiation levels and so on. But interesting, this is also something that the models are able to account for, because we don't provide any geometrical information to the models.
No.
But they are anyway able to account for these geometrical differences that are able to that are between spaces. They're able to learn this from the data we supply.
Maybe not surprising, but still nice to see that it is reproduced the way you would expect.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? I'm looking at the chat. Nothing there. Okay, then Jacob, thanks for your presentation. And we move on to the fourth speaker. And I hope I pronounced it right. That is Tarine Gaun. Tarine, are you in the audience? Yes. Can you please start your camera and share your screen? We're ahead of schedule a little bit, but if you're there, please have a go. And otherwise, yeah, okay. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so this is a video. We cannot hear this. Okay. If there's technology support in the background, can you make sure that the sound is on?
I'm Sarin Gaun. Hi, I'm Sarin Gaun, a full-time lecturer and doctoral candidate at the Department of Architecture and Industrial Design at the Tshwane University of Technology, South Africa. As a full-time lecturer teaching building physics and systems design, I specialize in the area of climate change, energy efficiency, and sustainability. My current research is also focused on building energy efficiency codes and finding adaptation and mitigation strategies, especially for the Global South. I'm very excited to be a part of the BSO2022 conference and to see the possible solutions towards climate change.
Welcome, everyone. Today I will be presenting this paper as part of my PhD research. The title of this paper is Using a System Dynamics Framework to Develop a Decision-Making Model for Building Energy Efficiency Codes in the Global South. Looking at the presentation outline, so we will have a look at the climate change problem or crisis, as well as the introduction and background, a little bit of methodology, and then a discussion of the results or findings, as well as the future SLIM, the model developed, and some conclusions. As we know, COP27 was one of the most anticipated climate conferences to date, and from the beginning this conference has been driven by two overriding themes, namely justice and ambition. Justice for those on the front lines who did so little to cause the crisis, and ambition to keep the 1.5-degree limit alive. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said something very fitting. He says, "Climate chaos is a crisis of biblical proportions. The signs are everywhere. Instead of a burning bush, we face a burning planet." This is the reality of climate change. He also made the observation that COP27 took place not far from Mount Sinai, a site that is central to many faiths and the story of Moses. But unlike those stories, we cannot wait for a miracle from a mountaintop. It will take each and every one of us fighting. This got me thinking, what role do we play in the lack of ambition and justice in this fight for climate change? So I ask myself, or what we as architects can do to create a more sustainable built environment and to create hope for future generations. Before we get to this answer, let's first have a look at the current problem within the built environment, specifically the Global South. Looking at the current climate change problem, we know that there's a direct link between buildings and climate change due to the high rate of carbon emissions from the construction and ongoing use of buildings. In 2019, total CO2 emissions from the building sector reached their highest ever levels, accounting for nearly 39% of global CO2 emissions. This is concerning and one of the major contributors to climate change. On a worldwide scale, communities are increasingly becoming more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. But as we know, Global South countries are more vulnerable to these risks, while the rapid growth of urbanization coupled with increased socioeconomic and environmental problems pose significant challenges to Global South countries. The diagram here on the left summarizes the significant challenges of the built environment. Firstly, looking at what are the socioeconomic conditions of each of these countries, looking at the climatic considerations or conditions as per the Köppen-Geiger map, looking at the different sectors of the built environment, so the energy sector, the actual building stock or the emissions, and also asking what is the status of building energy codes or related policies in the Global South. The diagram then also indicates the complex relationships and connections between these challenges and the Global South. As a result, it is necessary to decarbonize the built environment globally. We need to adopt more stringent and more precise compulsory building energy codes. While this is happening, we know that many Global South countries lack the necessary building energy codes and is also struggling to fulfill this real-world need. While we have established that one of the problems is the Global South's lack of building energy codes, this exacerbates the challenge of adopting building simulation and optimization tools. Therefore, the study aims to develop a system dynamics framework that could inform the development of a decision-making model, SLIM, which I will discuss a little bit later on, which focuses on building energy efficiency codes specifically for the Global South. The purpose of such a decision-making model or tool is to assist countries without the necessary building energy efficiency codes and to develop incremental implementation frameworks. Moving on to the methodology. For the methodology, I looked at the system dynamics approach, which uses a combination of theories, methods, and philosophies to investigate systems behavior in various environments. It leads to understanding how a system works and also a system predicting how situations might develop over time. After this, we evaluated the global north models. So global north models being the Sheridan, Fisker and Mayer framework, as well as the Nordic 5-level model. Thirdly, we looked at appropriate global south models, and this was based on a comparative study of 19 mandatory building energy codes in the global south. After this, we performed a comparison or amalgamation of the two global north models and the global south model. And this enabled us to propose a new global south model. Before we continue, we found it important to revisit the term global south in order to get the most recent and up-to-date delineation. The criteria included looking at a country's economic classification, as well as looking at the original Brunt line and whether this is still accurate, and then also including countries belonging to the Group 77 and China. Furthermore, looking at the status of building energy codes, the research revealed that 49% of the countries, the selected countries, do not implement any form of building energy efficiency codes, and that only 19 of the Global South countries have mandatory codes for the entire sector. The following part of the paper discusses the approaches to structuring building activities in both the Global North and the Global South. The first global north model that we looked at is the Sheridan, Fisker and Mayer model, and this is used to evaluate the built environment hierarchy, mostly used in Denmark, England, France, and other European countries. And this framework is used to structure the comparative analysis of regulations and codes, consisting of 3 levels. This is the objectives, the strategies, and parts of the building, accompanied by the various sections and descriptions of the various building elements and goals. The second global north model that we looked at is the Nordic 5-level model. This is a widely adopted method used to organize the various headings, subheadings, and themes of building energy codes. The Nordic model is initially used as a 5-level pyramid, with levels 1 to 5 indicating the overarching goals, objectives, functional statements, and so forth, whereby levels 4 and 5 is usually combined into one level. The results of this dynamic comparison highlight the similarities and indicate how we can use the Global North model successfully in the Global South. Moving on to the Global South model, the system dynamics approach emphasizes the need for building energy efficiency codes hierarchy of build elements that will respond to the contextual challenges of the Global South. This framework ensures harmonization between the different Global South codes and structures, and also puts part of the building into various systems, subsystems, and components. An overview of all 3 approaches and the various integration levels is provided in this image. The structure and the scope of these building energy codes and the identified attributes from all 3 methods are organized into corresponding levels and can now be amalgamated to successfully develop the new Global South model. So as previously stated, the foundation of this Global South model originates from both the Global North and the Global South. These 3 concepts are illustrated here as one comprehensive framework for structuring and developing building energy efficiency codes that are appropriate. The benefit of the proposed new framework is that it allows to identify patterns and similarities between existing codes. And it also allows generalizable decision-making principles that can be formulated by facilitating effective learning amongst the Global South countries. As a result, the new framework is used to develop and propose a Global South model, ultimately the SLIM decision-making framework. This is the research product of this study, which is titled the Sustainable Levels, Indicators Model, Matrix, and Maps. Moving on to the future SLIM, I would like to just give you an overall idea of how this model works. Looking at building energy codes in the Global South, the absence of performance-based requirements means that building simulations are mostly paper exercises with limited real-world value. To address this knowledge gap, we developed the SLIM tool as an interactive online platform. Here is an example of the SLIM prototype and how it works. And although it is still under development, the SIM will operate on predefined levels with user filters. The first filter will delineate countries based on the climatic conditions, which is defined by the Copenhagen climate classification. And this means that the platform users can filter their own options based on the climate of their desired location. The results will then be the identification of Global South countries with similar climatic conditions. Similarly, the second filter is the hierarchy of built elements that we have established, and users can decide on the hierarchy levels. And the user selection on the SIM will then identify Global South countries already addressing the selected items. As a result, the users can now decide whether to use the available values for prescriptive methods or to use this to conduct building simulations with the available data as a baseline. In conclusion, this study is unique, addressing limited research on the theme and the limited information available on building energy codes in the Global South. Building simulation in the Global South offers built environment professionals the opportunity to evaluate building performance amid the region's rapid growth and future development. However, building energy codes that form a basis for optimized and contextualized building simulation is lacking in 28 of the selected 57 Global South countries. Although this is a significant problem, the paper aimed to address this challenge by developing the framework and comparing building energy codes. And finally, the framework developed an online platform is expected to facilitate significant progress towards optimizing building design and operations in the Global South. In addition, the online platform, which is currently in progress, will serve as a repository for contextualized building simulation data, which is necessary for accurate predictions and reduce discrepancies. Thirdly, when we improve Global South simulation processes, practitioners can also access contextualized metrics, which enhances affordable simulation. And then lastly, when we look at the larger context, this paper and ultimately the SLIM model also addresses the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So where do we go from here? I say Global South countries should urgently address the lack of building energy codes and support global climate change initiatives before it's too late. Thank you for joining my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Tarine. That was a nice recording. I think Tarine is in the audience as well, so we could take any questions. I'm looking at the chat whether there's anybody from the audience. Yeah, Tarine is there. I do not see anything from the audience, so I'll start with a question of myself. And Jacob, can you stop sharing your screen? Tarine, one question I have. You mentioned system dynamics as an approach you use. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I've seen a little bit of system dynamics as a system which typically has these reinforcement loops where you see whether an effect becomes larger or smaller. I kind of wonder how that fits in the work you've been doing.
Hi, so good afternoon. So using the systems dynamics approach in this context, it's just based on the fact that it's learning from one another and seeing how systems operate and how they change over time, and using that as a basis for other countries or for the model, so that that can be interpreted and on that basis be used for other countries, even though say for instance we use this in South Africa, we can find similarities and we can find patterns based on either the climate or based on either the elements of the codes, and see how or where we find other patterns that are relatable and use that as an approach.
All right. And the other question, and this might be a bit of a trick question or a nasty question, given the debates we had yesterday. If you attended the session yesterday with David Coley and Annie Marston, there was a big element in there where they criticized the building codes as pushing us in a certain direction, which is away from predicting what really happens in the building. So on the one hand, I take your point that the Global South needs building energy efficiency codes to drive us in the right direction. But then there's the warning from the codes in the north that we might be pushing it too far. So what's your position on that one?
Yes, I've also had that quite a few times. And I agree that in one of the studies, I also do mention that the global north is moving away from building energy codes more to performance-based and building simulation. However, I do make the case that just in my study alone, out of the 57 countries, 28 of them don't have any codes. So where do you start if you don't have anything? So my position would be that we need to first get the global south, just as the global north started out with building energy codes and slowly progressing. I think for me, it's at least giving them this option and giving this information, because the SLIM model is a whole data set with all of this information available. They can at least start somewhere and then progress from there onto performance-based codes.
Yeah, I would think that having studied a little bit on the performance-based code as well, what I have seen is that the countries that have tried to go completely performance-based, and New Zealand is probably the most advanced country at one point trying to go fully performance-based. You come to a point that performance-based is great because you just measure performance and you allow all options. So it is flexible for design inside of things. But because everything is possible, it also becomes too complex. So I think New Zealand backpedaled at one point, saying, well, we need a little bit of prescriptive regular codes in there as well. So I think actually the Global South might be able to prevent going down all the way that some of the countries in the north have gone, and go straight for a healthy balance, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, yes, I think I 100% agree with you that there needs to be some form of prescriptive base. I've also seen in a few of the codes that they do limit certain, so there might be an overall performance, but there are also limitations or certain criteria that needs to be met in the specific elements, might be the windows or so on. However, again, I do make the point that we need to assist the Global South countries that don't have anything with at least a little bit of information. And I think the purpose of the SLIM is to give this information. And I think the purpose of the conference as well that we are speaking about is that this information is there, but it's not always freely available. It's not always easily accessible. So getting all of this information together on one platform for users or for policymakers to just go there and see what's happening without going, like you're saying, down the wrong path.
Good stuff. Okay, let's see whether there's anybody else from the audience asking questions. No, the audience is very quiet this afternoon, probably because we're getting towards the end of the conference. So thank you, and we'll move on to the final presentation. And I understand that it is also being pre-recorded, and that's by Aritro Day. So I look at, there was still one more question from Nicolas Swedberg just coming in. Let me see what I can, prescriptive performance code. Whether prescriptive is more cost effective. You want to answer that, Karine?
Sorry, what is the question?
There's a question from Nicolas Swedberg, and he says a comment on the discussion between the prescriptive and performance code is that the cost associated with performance codes, maybe the prescriptive is more cost effective.
Yes, well, so that is also I think it's the balance again between some people saying performance might be the better way to go, again within limitations, while yes, prescriptive might be a little bit more cost effective to implement, and that's why it's also easier to regulate. and
Exactly that,
better
yeah.
suited for the global south.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you both. And then we go to the recording of Aritra Day, and I ask the IT support to bring that in, I think.
Good afternoon, everyone. So this paper that I will be presenting is about predicting operative temperature with machine learning and how adaptive comfort controls can be implemented at scale to maximize ceiling or wall-mounted fan operation and also minimize air conditioning energy use. So according to IEA report, the demand for global space cooling is growing, and especially in building sector, 16% of the overall electricity consumption is accounted for space cooling. And in India, 92% of homes do not have, air conditioning installed. And as per the per capita energy consumption for space cooling is about 69 kilowatt hours. Compared to the world average of 272 kilowatt hours. And since the cooling energy is expected to grow significantly in the next 2 decades by 8 times, there is a special need to transform space cooling approaches in buildings. So in this paper, I will talk about how we are trying to minimize air conditioning energy use and maximize fan operation using adaptive thermal comfort model. So the National Building Code of India includes the Indian model for adaptive comfort, which we call it as IMAC, as a standard for thermal comfort. And we intend to implement thermal comfort controls based on IMAC, where thermal comfort band for indoor operative temperatures is a function of 30-day running mean of historical outdoor temperature values. You can see the IMAC band represented in this image as the yellow and the purple lines. So now this IMAC comfort model uses operative temperature as the comfort metric. However, operative temperature is not commonly used as a parameter for cooling system controls in buildings. This is because, globe temperature, mean radiant temperature, and air velocity is required to be measured to calculate operative temperature. And these parameters are difficult to measure in real time and long-term level due to, the nature of the equipment that is used. So in this paper, we use only an indoor air temperature sensor and a weather station, which is mounted in the building to predict operative temperature using machine learning. And we also use the impact in the upper limits of the comfort band due to change in the fan speed. So the aim of this paper is to use machine learning model to maximize the natural ventilation and fan operation in the space and minimize energy use for air conditioning. And it is also to demonstrate how operative temperature-based controls can be implemented with a feasible sensor regime in a way that makes the approach scalable for use in most buildings. This is intended to be used for mixed mode thermal comfort standards with control algorithms that can maximize fan operation and minimize cooling energy. So we are implementing the adaptive thermal comfort controls in this experimental building in India, which is about 450 meter square building. And it is built to test several technologies and operation practices, which can be applied in buildings that will come up in the rest of the 55-acre campus. So the building wall assembly that were used in this building are CSCB wall, rampered wall, and AAC wall, and all of the wall systems has insulation in it. And this building is heavily monitored in terms of indoor environmental quality, outdoor parameters, water, as well as energy. So to generate data sets for training the machine learning algorithm, 2 types of method was used. One is the measured data and the other is the data sets from the calibrated model. So early data of the weather station data, indoor air temperature, globe temperature, and airspeed was collected for a week. This 1 week data was collected for 2 reasons. One is to calculate operative temperature and then compare with simulated operative temperature to check the errors of the calibrated model. The other reason is to compare the predicted operative temperature through machine learning with the measured operative temperature, which is actually to test the machine learning algorithm. The calibrated model was used to generate different training data sets, weather station data, indoor air temperature, and wall surface temperature were collected to actually calibrate the model. The model was used to generate several annual data sets to be used for training and testing the machine learning algorithm. So to generate data sets, different scenarios were simulated for an entire year with the calibrated model. We simulated about 10 different scenarios, which included, changing window schedule, fan speeds, occupancy load, and equipment load. So the goal of the machine learning algorithm is to use a set of easily measurable indoor parameters and the weather station data to predict the indoor operative temperature. The training of the algorithm, we found that the explanatory variables were indoor air temperature, outdoor dry bulb temperature, outdoor wind speed, and outdoor relative humidity. Month of the year and hour of the day were also added later to these variables. So through an iteration or iterative process, we kind of arrived at this final set of variables. So like I mentioned, energy plus simulation was used to simulate 10 different scenarios. So we, using these 10 different scenarios and the data from it, we 75% of the data was used for training and 25% of the data was used for testing. So for testing, two steps were carried out. One, which in the first step of testing, the operative temperature that was predicted by the machine learning algorithm was compared with the actual operative temperature values from the data set. In the second step of testing, 1 week early data of the globe temperature, air temperature, and airspeed, which was collected, was used to calculate operative temperature and then measured with the predicted operative temperature. So we observed that, when we compared between the measured OT and the predicted OT, we also looked at different two errors, which is the mean bias error and the root mean square error. We also look at misclassification of whether, OT lies within or outside the comfort band of the IMAC band that we looked at. So the random, so talking about the results, the random forest algorithm was used for machine learning. We found RMSE for predicted OT was 0.34%. The chart here shows the difference between predicted and the simulated operative temperature. You can see x-axis is the month and the y-axis is the difference between the predicted and the simulated. So we found operative temperature lies between the indoor air temperature and the mean radiant temperature of the space. And in this building, the data shows that, indoor air temperature and surface temperatures are typically within 2 degrees Celsius of each other. This is likely because, the prediction within a narrow band between those of two variables has, such a high accuracy. The misclassification of operative temperature that was predicted, as being within or outside the adaptive thermal comfort band were also checked. So in this graph, x-axis is the month and the y-axis is the operative temperature that is predicted using a machine learning model. So the red dotted line in this graph is the adaptive thermal comfort band. The green dotted line shows the adjusted band for the impact of airspeed due to use of fan. So we found that 0.88% of the values were misclassified, with 0.46% of the values being misclassified as being outside the band and 0.42% being classified as being within the band. In the second step of testing, when the predicted OT values were compared with the 1 week measured OT values, the RMSE was found to be 3%. And in this chart, it shows the measured OT and the predicted OT. And the maximum OT was measured at around 30 degrees Celsius, and the average OT was measured at 28 degrees Celsius. The maximum error OT observed was about 1.3 degrees Celsius, and average error was about 0.6 degrees Celsius. So to finally conclude about this work, we developed a machine learning model for prediction of OT that uses only indoor air temperature sensor inside a space and a weather station that is mounted on a building. This approach is more affordable, scalable, and reliable in terms of the sensor regime compared to actually doing air temperature, airspeed, globe temperature measurements in each space in the building. So the machine learning algorithm also classifies the data points as being within or outside the adaptive thermal comfort band of, in India's National Building Code. It also uses the shift in the comfort band due to use of ceiling fans. So the next step is to integrate this work into a control system that takes advantage of the adaptive thermal comfort model to maximize fan operation and minimize air conditioning energy use in buildings. So this study will enable a scalable and affordable approach for accurate and long-term prediction of OT to determine the comfort conditions according to adaptive model, filling in a significant implementation gap to use OT for building system controls. And once the machine learning algorithm and control algorithm is ready, we plan to use it in our upcoming 55 acres campus. Thank you, and I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you for a very nice presentation. Richard, are you in the audience? Can we ask questions? Are you there? Yeah. Trying to find out whether we have Aritro in the audience.
Yeah, so this
Okay.
Amanda here, I'm one of the co-authors.
Okay, so you can take questions. Okay, let us go into the Q&A. So there's two questions. Parag Wade asked whether what could be the reasons for underpredictions by the machine learning model. Do we have an inkling for that?
Sure, so one of my other co-authors is also here. He will be able to answer this.
Okay.
I think it may be a confusion from one of the images. I think that we did not have a consistent underprediction. So one of the images had a operative temperature band, and that was above the predicted values, but the prediction errors actually were on either side of the mean. So there was not a consistent underprediction.
Okay, I hope that answered the question, Parag. And I see that the second was a follow-up comment where you just said that it looks like a few degrees, but we've just now discussed that is on both sides, so that is not the case. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, Parag is there. Okay, yeah. He said the second last slide, but can we bring back the slides? Probably not, or can you?
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Okay, maybe bring it up and see whether Parag has something to say on that, or whether we agree with what he observed. Are you able to share screen? Yeah, okay.
So I hope.
Yeah. So Parag was asking, for this one.
Yeah, so this is the comparison between the measured OT and predicted OT. So yeah, I think like what he said, there's 2 degree difference in this graph. You can see, as you can see. But the under prediction graph is this one that we were talking about. This we had done as a second round of testing using the measured operative temperature.
Okay. Parag, unless you put something else in the Q&A, I assume that is good. Yeah. Yeah, he's okay. Okay, so then I think, are there further questions? No, let's just double check whether there's anything else. No open questions. So we're done with the question. Okay, thank you, Amanda, for jumping in and for answering the questions. And then I'd like to thank all presenters on this session. This was a very broad session that went from artificial intelligence for control all the way to social economic models, and from the building service system level to the urban level to even the global south level. So we've been all over the place. But interesting, and then seeing how things connect is always good. So I'd like to thank Sergio, Nicolas, Jacob, Darienne, and Aritra for the presentations. And then we'll see you in the next session, which I think is the sponsor session, which starts at 2:45. Thank you, and that completes this session. Bye-bye.